The night in the valley was unnervingly still, a kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against the skin like a warning. Darkness clung to the jagged cliffs, wrapping them in shadows, while the moon remained hidden behind a quilt of drifting clouds. For most, this emptiness would have been suffocating. For the seals, it was familiar ground. They had trained for years to operate in such environments, where silence was both ally and enemy. Every footstep mattered. Every breath was measured. Every heartbeat was a reminder that discovery meant death. The team moved in a staggered file, each man scanning a different sector of the terrain. They were ghosts in combat fatigues, their bodies merging with the darkness, their minds wired to detect the faintest sign of threat. In their ears, radios whispered static and clipped instructions, keeping their rhythm tight and their confidence sharper. They had done this countless times in training, but the difference was unspoken. Training never had real bullets waiting in the shadows. Their objective was simple: on paper, move into the valley, gather reconnaissance on enemy movement, and prepare the ground for a larger strike force. The mission file had described the enemy as lightly armed, a scattered group of fighters with minimal coordination. But every SEAL knew better than to trust a file. Paper didn't account for cunning. Paper didn't account for how quickly an enemy could adapt. Sweat trickled beneath their helmets, though the night was cool. The weight of gear, weapons, and ammo was constant, pressing into their shoulders and lower backs, but none of them complained. Pain was just background noise. The real focus was the silence. No insects, no wind, not even the faint howl of a wolf. It was a silence so complete that it gnawed at the edges of their nerves. Nature was rarely this quiet, and when it was, usually meant something or someone had disturbed it. The point man crouched low, raised his fist. The line of SEALs froze instantly, bodies locking into cover with fluid precision. He had heard something, a faint crunch of gravel, not belonging to their boots. For long seconds they listened. Nothing. Just the weight of silence pressing harder. The team leader gave a hand signal. Proceed with caution. Every sense was tuned to maximum. As they advanced, the valley walls began to close in, creating a natural choke point. The terrain funneled them into a narrow stretch of rock and sand, where jagged cliffs towered above like silent sentinels. It was a dangerous place, a natural kill zone. No SEAL needed to say it aloud. They all knew. Their formation tightened, weapons angled upward, eyes darting between boulders and dark overhangs. The mission clock ticked steadily in their minds. They had to get through this section before dawn. Light would expose them, and exposure meant vulnerability. They trusted their camouflage, their silence, and their discipline, but the valley felt alive with unseen eyes. Inside, each man battled the same internal war: confidence versus doubt. They had fought in cities, jungles, and deserts. They had stared death in the face before and survived. But this place felt different. The terrain was too quiet, too calculated, as though the enemy had chosen it for them. Instinct whispered that the mission was about to turn. The team leader, a seasoned operator named Hayes, crouched near a boulder and studied the ground. Tracks, fresh, boots, not sandals. Organized movement. This wasn't a scattered group of fighters. This was something more. He gave a sharp signal, pointing at the trail, then slicing his hand across his neck, a silent warning. Proceed, but danger is imminent. The SEALs shifted. Their pace slower, more deliberate. Every step was a risk. Every shadow could conceal a rifle. Their breaths came shallow, controlled, as if even exhalation might betray them. The valley, once simply a geographical obstacle, now felt like a trap waiting to spring shut. They reached the midpoint of the choke point when the smell hit them, a faint tongue of burned tobacco. One of the men tensed immediately. Cigarettes. The enemy was close. Hayes clenched his jaw. Their position was already compromised. The fighters were near, probably waiting. A bead of sweat rolled down one SEAL's cheek, vanishing into the fabric of his collar. His trigger finger brushed against the cool steel of his rifle, itching to act, yet bound by discipline. They could not fire unless fired upon. That was the rule. But every instinct screamed that the rule might get them killed tonight. The radio crackled softly in Hayes's ear. A single phrase, hushed but sharp. Movement. Left ridge. He froze. Slowly, carefully, he raised his scope, scanning the jagged crest of stone. And there it was, the faintest silhouette. A man crouched, weapon slung across his chest, watching them. Hayes's stomach dropped. The file had been wrong. This wasn't a scattered group. This was an organized ambush. And they were already inside the trap. For one fleeting second, time seemed to stop. The SEALs were in perfect formation, every man ready to fight, but pinned in the worst possible ground. Enemy above. Narrow passage. No cover. Hayes's mind calculated the odds grim. Almost impossible. But there was no turning back. A flicker of light flashed on the ridge. A scope's reflection. Hayes's eyes widened. The first shot was about to come. The valley, silent for so long, was about to erupt. The valley didn't whisper its warning for long. The first shot cracked like thunder, ricocheting off the rock face and splitting the silence in two. Dust sprayed from the cliff just inches above Hayes's shoulder. The SEALs dropped instantly. Training overriding thought. Muzzle flashes erupted along the ridge, orange tongues of fire spitting from the darkness. Bullets shrieked overhead, tearing chunks of stone into the air. Contact. Left ridge. Hayes barked, though most of his men had already unleashed their rifles in reply. The valley roared with chaos. The SEALs were pinned, caught in a crossfire designed to kill. The cliffs glowed with streaks of tracer rounds, their fiery tails marking the incoming death. Rock shards sliced into skin, ripping tiny cuts across cheeks and forearms. The air filled with the metallic stench of gunpowder, acrid and suffocating. From above, the enemy had every advantage. They fired from height, from cover, raining down bursts in arcs that left little space to move. The SEALs scrambled behind. Boulders and outcroppings, their bodies pressed tight against stone, but there was no real cover. The valley had become a bowl, and they were the contents being crushed. One of the SEALs, Ramirez, shouted over the din. "They're hurting us." He was right. The enemy wasn't just shooting to kill. They were funneling the team deeper, driving them further into the choke point where escape would be impossible. Hayes cursed under his breath. He had seen this tactic before. It was a classic ambush, carefully laid and executed with brutal precision. The team returned fire, but the angle was wrong. Bullets skipped up toward the ridges, sparking against rock, rarely hitting flesh. The fighters above shifted positions, their silhouettes darting from shadow to shadow, as disciplined as any military Hayes had fought. Whoever these men were, they weren't random militants, they were trained. Smoke out. One SEAL called. A hiss erupted as canisters rolled across the ground, billowing thick plumes of gray. The smoke climbed into the air, curling and twisting, briefly masking the SEALs from the sights above. They used the moment to scramble further along the valley wall, seeking whatever meager cover they could find. But the enemy had anticipated it. Grenades clattered against stone, bouncing and spinning. "Frag!" someone shouted. The SEALs dove flat as explosions tore through the ground, shockwaves rattling their bones. Dirt rained down, stinging eyes, choking lungs. One man groaned, clutching his shoulder where shrapnel had torn through. Hayes crawled to him, dragging him behind a slab of rock, yelling for a medic. Time slowed in the chaos. Every second stretched thin, filled with the rattle of machine gun fire and the screams of ricocheting lead. The SEALs fired back in bursts, each trigger pull aimed with deadly intent, but the enemy kept coming, relentless. Then came the sound that chilled Hayes more than bullets, the deep, heavy chug of a PKM machine gun. The weapon roared from the right ridge, stitching fire across the ground in a deadly sweep. The team flattened, hugging the dirt as tracer rounds chewed a path inches from their faces. Sparks danced from their rifles as they pressed flat, helpless. Against the torrent, Hayes slammed his fist against the rock. This wasn't just a chance encounter. They had been baited, tracked, and pulled into the open. The mission file had lied, or worse, intelligence had been compromised. They weren't fighting a handful of scattered insurgents. This was a platoon, maybe more. Ammo check. Hayes shouted. Each SEAL called out quickly 3 mags, 5 mags, 2 left. The numbers weren't good. They had entered the valley heavy, but already burned through more than they could afford. And still, the enemy pressed down, tightening the noose. The teen sniper, tucked behind a narrow crack in the rocks, squeezed off a shot. One fighter crumpled on the ridge, tumbling down in a limp sprawl. A second fell moments later, his body jerking with the impact. For a brief instant, the SEALs felt the surge of hope that comes with a kill, but it was fleeting. For every fighter that dropped, 2 more appeared, pouring down fire. The valley's acoustics made the gunfire deafening. Every shot bounced between cliffs, doubling, tripling, until it became a wall of noise that swallowed thought. The SEALs shouted, but words vanished in the roar. They communicated with hand signals and instinct, each man trusting the other with blind faith. Hayes crawled to the edge of cover, peering through the smoke and haze. The enemy was everywhere. Shadows danced along the ridges, rifles spitting flame. More movement flickered at the far end of the valley fighters closing in from the rear. His blood ran cold. They weren't just pinned. They were being surrounded. One of his men, Dalton, grabbed his arm. His eyes were wide beneath his helmet, sweat streaking his face. "We're boxed in, Chief. They've got us on every side." Hayes's jaw clenched. The truth was undeniable. The valley had become their grave, dug long before they entered it. For the first time that night, a flicker of doubt pierced his resolve. Could they fight their way out? Or was this where their story ended? The enemy fire intensified, as though sensing the team's desperation. Bullets sparked from every angle, ricochets whining like angry hornets. A round clipped the rock beside Hayes's face, spraying fragments into his cheek. Warm blood trickled down, but he barely noticed. His focus narrowed to survival. "Hold the line," he roared, his voice raw against the storm. The SEALs responded with fury, rifles cracking in unison, grenades booming against the cliffs. For every inch the enemy pressed, they made them pay. But the pressure was mounting, unbearable, crushing. Somewhere in the smoke, Ramirez's voice broke through, ragged and certain. "We're dead." The words struck like a hammer. Every man heard them, though none responded. They didn't need to. The thought was already there, buried deep in their minds. Outnumbered, outgunned, pinned in a valley designed to kill them. For the first time, death felt inevitable. And the night was far from over. Asterisk, the firefight raged on, but something had shifted inside the men. Pinned behind a jagged outcrop of rock, bullets snapping inches above their helmets, the SEALs felt the cruel squeeze of inevitability. Ammunition clattered empty, magazines tossed aside, fingers searching for the next reload. Sweat stung their eyes, mingling with dust and blood. Their training screamed at them to fight, to move, to win. But deep down, each man knew they were running out of options. It was Dalton who finally said it aloud, his voice raw, torn from his throat, between bursts of return fire. "We're dead." The words cut sharper than any bullet. They echoed through the squad like a bell tolling at a funeral. Nobody rebuked him. Nobody snapped back with the usual "shut it, keep fighting." The silence that followed wasn't from hesitation. It was from recognition. Every one of them had thought it already. Dalton had only given the fear a voice. For a moment, even the gunfire seemed to fade. Hayes, crouched low with his rifle tight against his shoulder, felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. He had led men through hell before through. Firefights where the odds had been stacked against them, where sheer willpower had clawed victory from the jaws of death. But this felt different. The valley had been chosen perfectly. Their enemy was disciplined, coordinated, unrelenting. It wasn't just another firefight. It was an execution. Hayes forced himself to look at his men. Ramirez, his face smeared with dirt, teeth gritted as he fired short, controlled bursts. Dalton, eyes wide, shaking but still pulling the trigger. Pierce, the medic, crouched beside a wounded brother, hands red as he tried to stop the bleeding. They were warriors, his warriors, but they were also human. And humans could only take so much. The air was thick with dust and the coppery tongue of blood. Every breath felt like swallowing ash. The ridges above spat fire, muzzle flashes blinking, like angry stars. The ground trembled with the pounding of enemy rifles and the thud of grenades detonating too. Close. Hayes's radio crackled in his ear. "Chief, we can't hold them. They're closing in." It was Ramirez, but it could have been any of them. The truth was in the air, undeniable. The SEALs were being strangled by an enemy that outnumbered and outpositioned them 10-1. Hayes squeezed his eyes shut for the briefest second, trying to summon the right words. "We're not dead. We can make it." But the lie caught in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to say it. A deserved truth, not false hope. Instead, he pressed the radio. "We fight. We make them bleed for every inch. Stay tight. Stay alive. As long as you can." It wasn't a promise. It was a command to endure. The enemy pressure mounted. Machine guns hammered their position, pinning them so hard they couldn't even lift their heads without risking decapitation. Hayes crawled along the dirt, checking each man, shouting encouragement through the roar. His hands brushed the ground, warm from the sheer volume of rounds striking around them. The wounded SEAL groaned, clutching his torn shoulder. Pierce looked up, shaking his head. He didn't need to speak. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Hayes gripped the man's hand, squeezing it tight, whispering a promise. "You'll see home again. Hold on." But inside, he knew it was a prayer more than a promise. And still, Dalton's words haunted them. "We're dead." The phrase became a drumbeat in the back of their minds. It wasn't surrender. It was the acceptance of reality. Warriors didn't fear death. They feared failing their brothers, leaving them behind. But in that valley, surrounded and cut off, even the strongest began to wonder if this was how it ended. Memories flashed unbidden. Ramirez thought of his daughter's last birthday, the way she laughed when he lifted her onto his shoulders. Pierce thought of his wife, her tired smile the night before he deployed. Hayes thought of the faces of men he had already buried, brothers lost in other wars, whose ghosts seemed to whisper to him now, "It's your turn." Still, they fought. Training kept their fingers on the triggers, kept their rifles hot, kept their bodies moving even as their minds brushed against despair. Each man fired not for himself, but for the brother at his side. 2 mags left. Ramirez shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Hayes nodded grimly. He had 3. Dalton had 1. Pierce barely had half a mag, his hands too busy keeping the wounded alive. The numbers were death sentences written in brass. Hayes's heart pounded in his ears. Time warped. Seconds stretched like minutes. Every action felt sharper, more vivid, as though the brain, sensing its end, wanted to record every detail. The sting of smoke, the weight of his rifle, the grit of sand in his teeth. And then came the realization, the one that cemented Dalton's words into prophecy. Movement on the ridge. Dozens of figures advancing, their silhouettes bold against the faint glow of the horizon. The enemy wasn't just holding them, they were closing in, tightening the net. A kill team, moving with the confidence of wolves circling prey. Hayes's stomach dropped. He had seen this before, too many times. It was the moment when overwhelming force stopped pressing from a distance and started moving in for the finish. He glanced at his men. Each one knew it too. Their rifles clicked empty more often than they fired. The wounded man gasped for air. Ramirez's face twisted in rage and defiance as he reloaded his second-to-last mag. Dalton shook his head, whispering, under his breath prayers, maybe, or curses, "We're dead." The words no longer sounded like fear. They sounded like fact. And yet none of them surrendered. Hayes raised his rifle, sighted the advancing shadows, and fired until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. He slammed another mag in, chambered around, and fired again. Each shot was a statement. If we die here, we won't die quietly. The enemy fire intensified, bullets whistling so close that Hayes felt the air split against his cheek. Sparks burst, inches from his face. The SEALs answered with everything they had left, the valley echoing with defiance. But in their hearts, they knew. This was the edge of the line. Death was not a possibility anymore. It was a presence. It stood in the valley with them, walking closer with each burst of fire. And still, they fought, high above the valley, where jagged cliffs knifed against the night sky. A figure lay prone in silence. The sniper had been there for hours, motionless, patient, one with the stone beneath his chest. To most, the silence of the mountains was oppressive. To him, it was sanctuary. The wind whispered across his cheek, cool and steady. His breathing matched it slow, measured, almost imperceptible. He was the ghost no one saw, the shadow that lived between life and death. Through his scope, the valley unfolded in fragments. The faint glow of tracer rounds, the sharp bursts of muzzle flash, the scattered silhouettes of enemy fighters pressing their advantage against the pinned SEAL team. He had tracked their movements since dusk, watching the ambush form like a spider, weaving a web. He had seen the SEALs walk straight into it, unaware they had been marked long before entering the choke point. His crosshairs shifted deliberately, following a fighter as he rose to fire from behind cover. The man's mouth opened in a shout commanding. Others, perhaps. The sniper steadied his breath, finger brushing the trigger. He didn't shoot, not yet. Patience was his weapon, and timing was everything. He watched, always watched. The SEALs below were fighting with desperate fury, but the outcome was clear. They were surrounded, outnumbered, pressed into the dirt by superior firepower. The sniper could see it in their movements, the frantic reloads, the desperate bursts. Fired without clean sight lines, the way one man sagged against a rock, blood soaking his shoulder. He had seen enough battles to recognize that moment when soldiers stopped fighting to win and started fighting just to take someone down with them. His lips tightened into a thin line. He had worked with men like these before, SEALs, warriors, who gave everything without hesitation. And though they were strangers tonight, he knew them. He knew their silence, their resilience, their refusal to surrender, even when death hovered inches away. He couldn't let them be erased here. The sniper adjusted his rifle, nestling it deeper into the rock. His cheek pressed against the worn stock, familiar grooves fitting like an old handshake. His world narrowed to a single circle of glass, the reticle hovering over an enemy fighter moving closer to the valley floor. The man leaned forward, weapon raised, certain he was closing in on the kill. The sniper exhaled, slow, steady. Now. His finger tightened. The rifle bucked lightly against his shoulder. A single crack split the night. The fighter collapsed instantly, his body folding into the dirt like a puppet with its strings cut. Confusion rippled through the enemy ranks. Heads turned, voices rose. The SEALs ducked, startled, eyes darting upward into the ridges, but finding only shadows. The sniper remained still, already shifting his scope. One shot was nothing. Two would be disruption. A third would be terror. He found another target, an enemy squad leader barking orders from behind a crag of stone. The man's arm pointed, gesturing for his fighters to close in. The sniper tracked the movement, breathed, and squeezed. The round caught the leader square in the chest. He staggered, then fell backward into the darkness. Another crack echoed. Another body down. Below, the SEALs moved with renewed life, their heads snapping toward the sound, but finding only the invisible presence of a guardian in the hills. Hayes's eyes narrowed, realization dawning. Someone was out there. Someone was fighting for them. The sniper shifted again, never staying in one position long enough to be marked. He slid his body an inch to the right, readjusted, settled back into stillness. He became stone again, unseen, untraceable. Through his scope, the battlefield was a board, and he was moving pieces. His shots weren't random. Every trigger pull was chosen to shift the rhythm. First, disrupt leadership. Then, silence heavy weapons. Then, strike fear. He found the PKM gunner on the ridge, braced behind a bipod, raking the valley with streams of fire. The sniper steadied, revved, and fired. The machine gun went silent as its operator slumped forward, lifeless. For the first time since the ambush began, the tide faltered. The SEALs felt it immediately. The relentless storm of fire thinned. Hesitated. Hayes barked fresh orders, rallying his men. They pressed forward in short bursts, shifting positions, firing with sharper precision. Every time the enemy tried to regroup, another crack rang out, and another fighter dropped. The sniper remained unseen. His only presence was the steady rhythm of death delivered from the shadows. He didn't shout. He didn't celebrate. He simply worked, one target at a time, methodical as a surgeon. He remembered an old mantra whispered. Through training, one shot, one kill. 100 battles, one survivor. It wasn't just about accuracy. It was about discipline, about being the hand of inevitability in a world of chaos. Tonight, he was inevitability. Through the scope, he saw the fear growing in the enemy's eyes. Fighters who had pressed confidently minutes ago now hesitated, scanning the ridges, ducking lower, afraid to expose themselves. Leaders barked orders, but their voices carried panic. And still, the SEALs fought. With every passing second, their rhythm returned, their confidence rebuilt. The wounded were dragged deeper into cover, rifles reloaded with hands steadier now than before. They were no longer fighting alone. The sniper shifted once more, eyes narrowing on a figure creeping along the left ridge, trying to flank the SEAL's position. He tracked the man's movements, waited until the body rose just enough over cover, then fired. The fighter fell backward, limbs flailing. Hayes caught the movement, realizing again that someone somewhere was watching over them. For the first time that night, he felt a flicker of something stronger than survival instinct. Hope. Sniper reloaded calmly, his motions mechanical, perfected through endless repetition. He didn't think of glory or recognition. He didn't care if the SEALs ever knew his name. His purpose was simpler, to tilt the scales, to ensure warriors who should not die in that valley had the chance to fight another day. Down below, amid a chaos, Dalton muttered, almost in disbelief. We're not dead. Not yet. Hayes glanced up at the ridges, his lips tightening into the faintest grin. Whoever the silent watcher was, he had arrived at the moment they needed most. And in that instant, the valley was no longer just a kill zone. It had become a battlefield with two sides, one of them invisible, patient, and merciless. The sniper. Adjusted again, the reticle finding its next target. His breathing slowed, his finger curled. The war in the valley was far from finished. But death no longer hunted only one side. The crack of the sniper's rifle still echoed through the valley when the fighter fell. 1 second he was charging, weapon raised, mouth open in a war cry. The next, his body folded violently into the dirt. It wasn't like the chaotic spray of machine gun fire or the random hail of grenades. This was different, sharp, precise, absolute. One bullet, one kill. For the first time since the ambush had sprung, the valley paused. Enemy fighters froze mid-motion, their eyes darting toward the ridges. Confusion rippled through their ranks, breaking the rhythm that had pressed the SEALs to the edge of collapse. They had expected screams of surrender by now, the final flailing resistance of cornered prey. Instead, their momentum had been interrupted by an invisible hand. The SEALs felt it instantly. Hayes, crouched behind shattered rock, heard the echo roll away and frowned. That wasn't one of his men. He knew every rifle in his squad by its voice, and this was something else entirely deeper, cleaner, carrying a crack that split the night with authority. Then came the second shot. Another fighter, halfway through reloading, dropped where he stood. No scream, no chance to react, just a lifeless heap crumpling to the ground. The SEALs' heads snapped up, almost in unison. Ramirez blinked, his jaw tight with disbelief. Dalton muttered, "Holy shit," under his breath. Even the medic Pierce looked up from the wounded man long enough to register what had just happened. Somewhere up in the ridges, someone was hunting their hunters. The enemy erupted into panic. Shouts carried across the valley in a language the SEALs only half understood, but the tone was unmistakable fear. Fighters ducked lower, some abandoning their forward advance to press flat against the rocks. The confidence that had fueled their relentless push wavered, shaken by an unseen predator. Hayes's instincts screamed at him, "Don't waste this moment." He raised his voice over the gunfire. "Push fire. Keep them down." His men responded instantly, rifles cracking in controlled bursts. The air filled with fresh noise, SEALs fighting not just to survive, but to exploit the sudden disruption. Each man leaned into his weapon, rounds snapping up toward the ridges. For the first time that night, they weren't just holding on, they were pressing back. And then came the third shot. This one struck a squad leader. Hayes could tell by the way the man had been shouting orders, waving his fighters forward despite the growing chaos. He rose to rally them, his chest puffed with authority, and the sniper's bullet punched clean through him. He jerked backward and collapsed, arms spread wide as if in surrender to gravity itself. The silence that followed wasn't literal. The valley was still alive with gunfire, but it was spiritual. The enemy's rhythm shattered completely. Without their leader, without their momentum, they hesitated. Hayes felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the first burst of fire had torn the valley open. Hope. The sniper's work was surgical, almost cruel in its precision. He didn't waste bullets on foot soldiers scrambling in panic. No, he hunted the critical pieces, the heavy gunner, the squad leader, the bold fighter who dared break cover to rally his brothers. Each one fell, one by one, as if chosen. Through the chaos, the SEALs began to move differently. Ramirez and Dalton shifted positions, bounding between rocks, trading cover fire. Pierce finished tying off the wounded man's shoulder, then picked up his rifle again, his eyes burning with new fire. They weren't free, not yet, but the invisible hand above had tilted the scales just enough for them to breathe. "Who the hell is up there?" Dalton shouted over the gunfire. "Doesn't matter," Hayes barked back. "He's on our side." Another shot cracked, and another enemy fell. The fighters who had pressed so confidently began to break. Some still fired wildly into the valley, but their rounds lacked the discipline of before. They were no longer the hunters. They were prey, uncertain when the next invisible strike would find them. Hayes saw it in their movements, the flinches, the hesitation before exposing themselves, the frantic way they scanned the ridges. They were afraid of the ghost in the hills. He turned to his men, his voice sharp with renewed command. "Shift left, on me." They moved, fast and precise, sliding along the valley wall, while the sniper's fire masked their advance. Bullets still hissed and cracked around them, but now there was space to maneuver, to think, to fight like seals instead of trapped animals. The sniper fired again, and again, each shot punctuating the night like a drumbeat of salvation. The seals pushed further along the wall, rifles chattering, grenades booming as they silenced nests of fighters who had lost their courage. Then, for a moment, the sniper went silent. The enemy seized it instantly, raising their heads, shouting to one another. One fighter, braver than the rest, leapt up with his weapon, firing a wild burst down into the valley. A heartbeat later, the sniper struck. The fighter's body spun, his rifle clattering from his hands as he collapsed in a heap. The silence had been a trap allure to make them believe the ghost was gone. The lesson was brutal. The sniper wasn't just killing them. He was controlling them. The SEALs realized it too. Every shot wasn't just protection. It was strategy. Whoever this man was, he wasn't firing blindly in their defense. He was orchestrating the battlefield, shifting the flow, breaking the enemy's will one bullet at a time. Hayes pressed against the rock, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the ridges above. He couldn't see the sniper, not even a glint of glass, but he knew this wasn't luck. This was mastery. Down the valley, one of the enemy fighters screamed something guttural, rallying those around him. Hayes could see them gathering, preparing for another push despite the sniper's presence. "Here they come again," Ramirez shouted. The SEALs braced themselves. Rifles rose, eyes narrowed, breaths steadied. Hayes felt the weight of inevitability settling again. The sniper had bought them time, but the enemy wasn't done. Not yet. And then, just as the fighters surged, the sniper fired twice in quick succession. Two advancing figures collapsed mid-stride, tumbling into the dust. The charge faltered, broke apart, dissolved into scattered retreat. The valley filled with chaos once more, but this time it was the enemy's chaos. The SEALs didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. Their faces remained hard, their focus unbroken. But inside, each man felt it, the shift. They weren't walking dead anymore. They were alive. And it was because of a rifle in the hills, wielded by a ghost who refused to let them die. The valley had changed. What only minutes before had been a death trap, now hummed with a different rhythm. The SEALs, once pressed flat against stone and bleeding into the dirt, had begun to rise. Their shoulders straightened, their movements sharpened, their fire disciplined once more. It was the same team, but with the weight of inevitability lifted, they fought like wolves unleashed. And always, somewhere above, the sniper's rifle cracked. Each shot fell like punctuation sharp, deliberate, final. The enemy fighters could not track him, could not silence him. They only felt the consequences, men collapsing mid-step, leaders silenced before their commands were complete, gunners slumping over their weapons before they could unleash another barrage. Hayes knew the battlefield well enough to recognize the shift. Momentum wasn't an accident. Momentum was everything. And right now, it belonged to them. Dalton, Ramirez cover left. He barked, "Pierce on me, push forward." They moved in unison, low and fast. Fire kicked up around them, bullets shattering stone, but the sniper's rhythm cleared their path. Each time an enemy lifted his head, a crack split the night and sent him crashing down. The SEALs weren't just holding anymore. They were advancing. Dalton's M4 barked in controlled bursts, the sound blending with Ramirez's precise single shots. Together, they laid a curtain of fire that forced enemy fighters to duck deeper into their cover. Hayes and Pierce slid into a new position 20 yards forward, rifles raised, grenades ready. "Frag out!" Pierce shouted, lobbing a grenade over the ridge. It detonated with a sharp, concussive blast that lit the valley for a heartbeat. Rocks splintered, and the scream of a wounded fighter carried into the night. Hayes didn't waste the opening. He leaned out, his rifle bucking as he poured fire into the shaken group. 2 dropped instantly. The rest scattered, their formation breaking apart. And again crack. Another fell, a clean shot from the hills. The ambushers were unraveling. Their confidence, so strong at the beginning, now curdled into panic. They had sprung a trap and found themselves ensnared by something greater, a ghost they couldn't see, and SEALs who refused to die. Hayes knew this was the moment to push harder. Keep pressure. Don't let them regroup. The team obeyed. Dalton's laughter cut through the chaos, wild and raw. "Come on, you bastards!" He fired another burst, cutting down a fighter trying to scramble up the slope. Even Ramirez, usually stone-faced, muttered under his breath. "They're breaking." They were. Hayes could feel it. The enemy's fire, once constant and overwhelming, grew ragged and scattered. Shots cracked from random angles, but lacked the coordinated timing of before. Their leaders were gone, their gunners silenced, and fear gnawed at whatever discipline they had left. Then the sniper struck again. This shot was different. Not just another kill, but a message. The round slammed into a fighter carrying an RPG as he rose to fire. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. A flash that lit the ridge like lightning, hurling debris and bodies alike into the night. The valley shook. The SEALs cheered instinctively, their voices rising with a feral energy. Hayes clenched his teeth, forcing his focus back. He couldn't let the adrenaline blind him. This wasn't over, not yet. The enemy still had numbers, and desperation could make them dangerous. But the tide had turned. He could feel it. "Pierce, check ammo," Hayes barked. 3 mags left. Dalton? 2.5. Ramirez? Plenty. I'll feed. Hayes nodded sharply. They weren't out of the woods, but they had enough to push. And with the sniper still up there, silent, patient, merciless, they had the edge. The enemy tried once more to mount a counterattack. A cluster of fighters rallied behind a boulder, leaning out with rifles spitting fire. Tracers zipped low, carving sparks from the stone near Hayes's head. "Contact, right?" Dalton shouted, ducking back. Hayes leaned around, sighted, and fired, but before his second round left the barrel, the sniper struck. 1 shot. The lead fighter fell. The second shot came a heartbeat later. Another man dropped. The rest scattered, the will to stand shattered by the ghost in the hills. Hayes couldn't help himself this time. He let out a bark of laughter, sharp and fierce. "He's cutting them apart." They pressed forward again. Grenades boomed, rifles cracked. The valley floor became a graveyard of broken plans, littered with the bodies of men who had believed they were predators. For the SEALs, every yard gained was oxygen. With each step, they reclaimed their confidence, their purpose. They weren't surviving anymore. They were winning. And still, the sniper hunted. His fire grew less frequent now, but no less devastating. Each shot carried weight, chosen carefully. Hayes realized the pattern. The man wasn't just killing at random. He was directing them, opening gaps, removing threats, shaping the battlefield. Like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Where the sniper struck, the SEALs found opportunity, and they seized it. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the fight grinding into a brutal rhythm of advance and suppression. The enemy dwindled, their fire growing weaker, their movements desperate. Some tried to retreat deeper into the ridges, but the sniper's scope followed. Others froze, trapped between the SEAL's fury and the unseen rifle above. By the time the shooting slowed, the valley was no longer a kill zone. It was theirs. The surviving fighters broke completely, scattering into the darkness, their shouts fading as they fled into the mountains. A few lingered too long, and the snipers' rifle found them, silencing their retreat with finality. Then silence. True silence. The only sounds were the SEAL's ragged breathing, the faint clatter of empty magazines on stone, and the distant wind brushing through the cliffs. Hayes crouched behind a boulder, chest heaving, sweat and dust streaking his face. He scanned the ridges, eyes straining for any sign of the sniper. Nothing. No glint, no movement. Just shadow. Dalton collapsed against a rock, laughter bubbling out of him. Half hysteria, half relief. We're alive. Jesus Christ, we're alive. Pierce sat heavily beside the wounded man, checking his bandages, his hands steady now that the storm had passed. Ramirez leaned against the valley wall, silent as always, but his eyes burned with a quiet fire. Hayes exhaled slowly, his heart still pounding. They should all be dead. Every calculation, every trap, every advantage had belonged to the enemy, and yet they were here. Because of him. The ghost in the hills. Hayes looked up once more, his voice low, almost reverent. Whoever you are, thank you. No answer came. The sniper remained silent, as if he had never been there at all. Only the lingering memory of his rifle, the sound that had broken. The silence turned the tide and saved them from certain death remained. But Hayes knew. Somewhere out there, the silent watcher was still lying prone, still watching, still ready. And as long as he was, the SEALs were not done. Not by a long shot. The gunfire faded into silence. Not the tense pause of men catching their breath before the next assault. This was different, final. The last echoes of rifle cracks rolled away into the cliffs until all that remained was the whisper of the mountain wind and the ragged breathing of the survivors. For a long moment, none of the SEALs moved. They crouched where they were, rifles still raised, ears straining, eyes scanning the ridgelines for movement. Their bodies screamed with exhaustion, but their minds refused to believe it was over. Hayes broke the silence first, his voice low, tight. Check sectors. Nobody gets complacent. Ramirez shifted slowly, sweeping his rifle across the left ridge. Dalton did the same on the right, his hands trembling from the adrenaline dump. Pierce crouched over the wounded man, rechecking his bandages even though he knew nothing more could be done out here except keep pressure and hope. Minutes passed, no movement, no gunfire, no enemy war cries. Just the stillness of a battlefield, cooling after the storm. Dalton finally let out a shaky laugh, more relief than humor. We should be dead, every one of us, but we're not. Ramirez didn't look at him, didn't smile. His voice was flat, quiet. Not yet. Hayes felt the weight of both truths. They had survived the ambush, but survival wasn't safety. They were still deep in hostile territory, low on ammo, one man wounded, and no clear way out. The mountain didn't care that they had lived through the night. It would swallow them whole by dawn if they didn't move. And then there was the ghost. Hayes lifted his gaze to the ridges, scanning the jagged silhouettes under the moonlight. Somewhere up there, a sniper had saved them all. Precision like that didn't come from chance. This wasn't some farmer with a rifle. It was someone trained, someone skilled enough to turn the tide of a battle with single shots. But he remained unseen, silent, watching, perhaps, or gone. Hayes didn't know which unnerved him more. He rose slowly, dust and blood streaking his uniform, and crossed to Dalton. The younger man was reloading with shaky hands, muttering under his breath. Hayes crouched beside him. "You hold it together?" Dalton gave a weak grin. "Held enough. I'll take credit for the last 3 guys, though. Pretty sure they were already dead when I shot him. But hey, they don't know that." Hayes smirked despite himself. Humor in the aftermath wasn't just bravado, it was survival. It kept the mind from fracturing. Pierce's voice cut across the calm. "Hayes, he's stable for now, but we need evac. Soon." Hayes crouched beside the wounded SEAL, studying his pale face and the dark stains spreading across his shoulder. The bandage was soaked through. He'd lost too much blood already. Without extraction, he wouldn't last. Hayes's jaw clenched. Extraction wasn't just a call. Out here, in these mountains, it was a prayer, and prayers often went unanswered. He rose again, lifting his radio. Static hissed back at him. No signal. The cliffs smothered every attempt. They were alone, or almost alone. Dalton followed his gaze toward the ridges. "Think he's still up there?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the jagged peaks, every shadow a possibility. If he is, he doesn't want to be found. Could be local? Dalton pressed. Militia guy? Maybe doesn't like the Taliban any more than we do. Maybe, Hayes said, but he didn't believe it. He'd seen militia shooters before. They sprayed rounds in desperation, praying for luck. Whoever had been above them tonight wasn't praying. He was deciding, picking, ending lives one by one with surgical control. That kind of discipline didn't come from farmers or villagers. That was training, military training, which raised another question. Whose? The thought gnawed at him. Whoever the sniper was, he had saved them, but that didn't make him a friend. Ramirez broke the silence. Doesn't matter who he is. He bought us time. We should move before more of them regroup. Hayes nodded. Ramirez was right. The enemy might have scattered, but fear didn't erase numbers. Reinforcements could already be on their way. The valley floor was a death sentence if they stayed. Pack it up, Hayes ordered. Ramirez, take point. Dalton, you've got rear. Pierce, keep him alive. He nodded at the wounded man. We're heading north. High ground, then we find comes. They moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the aftermath. Boots scraped against stone. Metal clinked softly. Their breaths came heavy, mingling with the cool mountain air. Each man carried the exhaustion of battle, but none dared slow. Survival demanded motion. As they climbed out of the valley, Hayes cast one last glance over his shoulder. The kill zone lay quiet, bodies scattered like discarded shadows. He knew what had almost happened there. He could still feel it, the weight of inevitability, the suffocating certainty of death. And he knew why it hadn't happened. The sniper, but the ghost left no trace. No flash, no figure, not even the faintest silhouette against the moonlight. Just silence. Hours bled into the night as they moved higher into the ridges. The wounded man groaned occasionally, his breath ragged, but Pierce kept him moving. Dalton muttered to himself, sometimes cursing, sometimes laughing under his breath, as if still trying to process the insanity of it all. Ramirez stayed silent, eyes sharp, rifle steady. Hayes carried the weight of command, every decision pressing on him like the stone walls around them. His men looked to him, trusted him, followed him. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop replaying the cracks of the rifle that weren't his. Finally, near dawn, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. They huddled there, exhausted, drinking from canteens, conserving the last of their strength. The sky bled faint orange at the edges, promising daylight. Dalton broke the quiet. "You think we'll see him again?" Hayes didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "If he wanted us to, we would have already." Pierce looked up briefly from tending the wounded. "Whoever he was, he saved us. That counts for something." Hayes finally turned, meeting each of their eyes. "Don't mistake mercy for allegiance. We don't know who he is, or what he wants. All we know is we're still breathing because of him." Ramirez's voice was as flat as stone. "Breathing's enough for now." The men fell silent again, the weight of truth settling over them. They were alive, yes, but they were not safe. They were deep in enemy territory, with no comes, dwindling supplies, and dawn rising to expose them to whoever still hunted in these mountains. And somewhere, perhaps still watching, perhaps already gone, was the ghost with the rifle. Hayes leaned back against the rock, exhaustion pressing in, but his eyes never left the ridges. He knew tonight's battle wasn't an ending. It was a reprieve, survival bought at a price. The shadows stretched long across the mountains as the first true. Rays of sunlight touched the peaks. The seals sat in silence, listening to the wind, to the steady breath of their wounded comrade, to the lingering memory of a rifle that had cracked open the night and rewritten their fates. They had survived the valley, but survival was just the beginning. The mountains still waited, the enemy still hunted, and the ghost still lingered in the shadows of survival. Dawn crept across the mountains like a slow burn, spilling gold into the jagged ridges. The shadows that had hidden them through the night dissolved, leaving the seals exposed on their narrow perch. Hayes squinted into the light, his eyes gritty from exhaustion. Every muscle in his body ached, every nerve frayed, but there was no time to rest. Survival in the dark was one thing. Surviving daylight was another. Daylight meant drones, patrols, and eyes in every village below. The wounded man stirred, groaning as Pierce adjusted his bandages. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, but he was alive, barely. Hayes knew their window was closing. Without extraction, the man wouldn't see another sunset. Ramirez crouched at the edge of the ledge, scanning the valley below. The battlefield stretched out in brutal silence, bodies scattered where they had fallen. Smoke still rose faintly from the spot where the RPG had detonated, curling upward like a ghost refusing to leave. Dalton sat with his back to the rock, staring out at the ridges with wide, restless eyes. He hadn't stopped muttering since they'd climbed out of the valley. Sometimes he cursed. Sometimes he laughed quietly to himself. Sometimes he whispered, "We should be dead," like a mantra. None of them said it aloud, but the thought was shared. They weren't alone in their survival. Hayes looked again to the ridges. Somewhere out there, the ghost was watching. The sniper who had turned the tide with single merciless shots. Man who had decided, for reasons unknown, that the seals would live. But who was he? Hayes's mind wrestled with the possibilities. An allied operator? Another American team working covertly in the region? A local fighter with impossible skill? Or something darker, someone playing his own game in these mountains, using them as pieces on a board only he could see? They couldn't know, and that ignorance gnawed at Hayes like hunger. "Cap," Ramirez said quietly, eyes still on the valley. "We can't stay here. More will come. They'll search the valley when their dead don't return." Hayes nodded. He knew Ramirez was right. They had to move, but the wounded man slowed them, and without comes, they were wandering blind. He lifted his radio again, pressing the transmitter. Static. Nothing. The mountains swallowed their calls like an ocean swallowing stones. They needed higher ground. "Pack up," Hayes ordered, voice sharp despite the weariness weighing on him. "We move north," ridge to ridge. We find signal, we call for bird, nobody lags. They rose, moving like ghosts themselves, slipping through rock and shadow. Every step was a battle against fatigue, but the discipline of their training carried them forward. Pierce shouldered most of the wounded man's weight, refusing help even when Dalton offered. "I've got him," Pierce snapped. "Just keep us covered." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the stone, sucking the moisture from their throats. Their canteens were nearly empty, their rations gone. The silence of the mountains pressed down on them, broken only by the crunch of boots and the rasp of breath. And still, Hayes felt the sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct, sharpened by years of combat. The sniper hadn't left them. He was out there, somewhere in the endless folds of rock and shadow, unseen but present. Once, Hayes caught a flicker on a distant razzia glint, perhaps, or just the sun catching a stone. He raised his rifle, scope searching, but found nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the certainty. They weren't alone. By midday, they reached another rise. The view stretched wide, the valley behind them reduced to a scar across the landscape. Hayes lifted his radio again, adjusting, angling, praying. This time, a faint signal crackled back. "Falcon, this is Talon 2. Do you copy?" Hayes's voice was hoarse, urgent, static. Then, "Talon 2, this is Falcon. Copy. What's your status?" Relief washed through him, though he kept his voice steady. "We're 4 effective, 1 critical. Ambushed. Need immediate evac, grid coordinates to follow. Understood. Hold position. Bird inbound. ETA 35 mics. 35 minutes. An eternity, but also salvation." Hayes lowered the radio, meeting his men's eyes. "We've got a ride. We just have to hold." Dalton exhaled loudly, slumping against the rock. Thank God. But Hayes didn't relax. 35 minutes in these mountains was forever. Enough time for enemies to regroup, to hunt, to strike. They had to prepare. The SEALs set a perimeter, rifles aimed outward, eyes scanning every ridge. Hayes crouched low, his gaze never leaving the horizon. He trusted his men. But part of him trusted more in the ghost. The minutes dragged. The sun burned hotter. Sweat streaked their faces, mixed with dust and dried blood. Every sound made them flinch. The distant call of a bird, the tumble of a rock down a slope, the whisper of wind shifting through the cliffs, and then movement. Ramirez spotted it first. A cluster of figures, far to the south, picking their way up the valley floor. Armed, moving fast. "Contact," Ramirez hissed. "South ridge closing." Hayes's stomach tightened. Reinforcements. They'd found the bodies. Now they were coming to finish what their brothers had started. "Steady," Hayes ordered. "Hold fire until—" "They're in range." The SEALs braced, rifles ready. Dalton muttered, 35 minutes, my ass. They'll be on top of us in 10. The figures drew closer, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. Hayes counted at least a dozen too many for a direct fight with their limited ammo. His mind raced, calculating fields of fire, angles of retreat, and then crack. One of the advancing figures collapsed. The SEALs froze. Hayes's eyes snapped to the ridges. Another crack. Another fighter dropped. The ghost was here. The enemy faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. They shouted, scattered, tried to press forward, but the sniper cut them down with merciless rhythm. Each shot was a death sentence, each pause a trap. The SEALs added their fire, sharp and precise, and the valley became a killing ground once more. Within minutes, the reinforcements broke. Survivors fled back the way they'd come, leaving their dead behind. Silence returned, broken only by the faint ringing in the SEALs' ears. Dalton let out a low whistle. I'll be damned. He's still watching. Hayes's throat was dry, but he managed, not watching, guarding. They waited the rest of the 35 minutes in tense silence. No more enemies came. The sniper never revealed himself, but his presence lingered in every shadow. When the thrum of rotor blades finally reached them, it felt like salvation carried on the wind. The Black Hawk swept over the ridge, circling before lowering into the clearing. Dust whipped into their faces, stinging their eyes, but none of them cared. They moved fast, half carrying the wounded man, weapons still raised until they were inside the bird. The crew chief yanked them aboard, shouting over the roar of the rotors. As the Black Hawk lifted, Hayes looked back one last time at the ridges. His eyes scanned desperately, searching for any sign of the ghost. A silhouette, a wave, anything. But there was nothing. Just stone and shadow. The sniper had vanished as silently as he had appeared. Hayes sat heavily against the wall of the hill. Chopper, exhaustion crashing into him. Dalton grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. Ramirez said nothing, his expression unreadable. Pierce worked furiously on the wounded man, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. The mountains fell away beneath them, the battlefield, shrinking into memory. But Hayes knew the truth. They hadn't left alone. They carried the ghost with them, not in body, but in memory, in every shot that had spared them, in every moment of survival, bought by a man they would never meet. As the Black Hawk banked north, the sun rising higher, Hayes closed his eyes. They had survived, not by chance, not by luck, but by the mercy of a sniper who moved like a shadow and struck like death itself. The SEALs would never know his name, but they would never forget the ghost in the mountains.